With the latest agriculture news from across the state and nation, it's time for the AgNet News Hour from AgNet West. Here's your host, Sabrina Halvorson.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us this morning on the AgNet News Hour. Coming up later, CDFA's Industrial Hemp Advisory Board nominations are due next week. We'll have the details, but our top story today, the House Agriculture Committee took up the topic of financial conditions in farm country Tuesday with a hearing on the matter.
Ag bankers have a deep appreciation for the important role producers play in our economy and the unique challenges they face.
One of the witnesses was chairman of the Agriculture and Rural Bankers Committee of the American Bankers Association, Tony Hotchkiss of Evansville, Indiana. He told lawmakers about the connection between bankers and farmers.
Banks continue to be one of the first places that farmers and ranchers turn when looking for agricultural loans. Our agricultural credit portfolio is very diverse. Banks finance large farms, small farms, urban farmers, beginning farmers, women farmers, minority farmers. To bankers, agricultural lending is good business, and we make credit available to all who can demonstrate they have a sound business plan and the ability to repay. With our deep connection to farmers and ranchers, banks are often the first to see changes within balance sheets and cash flows on the farm operation, often due to changing economic conditions.
And he said this is what they're seeing now.
With rising input costs and lower commodity prices, farmers and ranchers have worked through the liquidity and working capital they built up over the past few years at a more rapid pace than anticipated and are now beginning to leverage equity through refinancing debt. This has made agricultural bankers feel like they are looking over the cliff in regards to the agricultural economy. For example, we are hearing that bankers already are starting to refinance debt for almond growers in California, and we are hopeful this is an outlier and not a growing trend.
He said the challenge with refinancing is that with low commodity prices, it can be difficult to meet the new payment requirements of the refinanced debt.
The USDA is projecting net farm income to drop approximately 25% from 2023 to 2024. Some regions of the country will feel the effects sooner than others, but all will feel it.
He encouraged lawmakers to pass a farm bill and to keep current tax exemptions for farmers, such as the estate tax and capital gains exemptions. He also supported the Access to Credit for Rural Economy, or ACRE Act, which he said would create a level playing field for all lenders to agriculture. Over 3 million acres of American farmland were sprayed by drones last year alone. As more farmers use drones for spraying and scouting, there are concerns that drones made in China pose a major risk to our national security. CJ Miller has the story.
A country like China, which is in economic competition with us and perhaps even more serious competition in the future, it'd be foolish to think that they wouldn't try to use every advantage that they have to get an edge economically.
And that's Arthur Erickson, CEO of Helio, a drone manufacturer based in Texas. He says the main concern has been over the use of drones that come from a Chinese company called DJI.
Back in 2017, the Department of Homeland Security put out a memo stating that they had strong reason to believe that DJI drones were sending critical information back to the Chinese government that could be used to undermine U.S. national security. So then you start to see in the National Defense Authorization Act of 2019 that the Chinese-made drones were in fact banned for purchase and use by the U.S. government. Now that ban and those concerns have grown even further. And so there are calls to ban Chinese drone use outright. So not just in the public sector, but also the private sector here in the States.
Erickson says there's legislation that's passed in the U.S. House and now pending in the Senate that would effectively ban the use of drones made by DJI.
And what it will do is basically make DJI into a covered entity as defined by the government, which means that they would not be allowed to have FCC authorization to operate on the frequencies and communication channels in our country. So all the drones would basically become paperweights because they need those communications to function, obviously.
In addition to the concerns over the use of drones being used by the Chinese government to spy on the U.S., according to USDA, China is known to own nearly 350,000 acres of U.S. farmland across 27 states. I'm CJ Miller.
You are listening to the AgNet News Hour. I'm Sabrina Halvorson. In today's National Spotlight, a very sudden derecho and a few tornadoes tore through the Midwest. But how sudden was it really? Riley Smith has more.
As always, there are answers to that in the observed climate patterns. Iowa's state climatologist Dr. Justin Glisson said a heat dome effect is what spurred the rapid development of a derecho.
So we can tie the heat that we saw over the weekend with the derecho that started here in Iowa. We had a big heat dome that was sitting over the Midwest. So you have two mechanisms for warmer temperatures. You have air from the southern part of the United States moving up, so warmer air. But in a stable high pressure system like that heat dome, you have descending air that warms compressionally as the pressure rises when you get towards the surface, so secondary heating. So we saw temperatures in the low to mid 90s and then overnight lows in the 70s, so 10, 15 degrees above where we should be.
Of those few tornadoes, one F1 tornado dashed through the urban Des Moines area. Glisson said that due to the speed of the storm, there wasn't a very early warning, but we were thankfully able to avoid fatalities and injuries.
Now, also of note is F1 tornado through the western side of the Des Moines metro. In fact, about a half mile southwest of my house. And the storm that had produced that tornado was moving 50 miles per hour. So the path length of that tornado was 7 miles into the city, very rapidly moving and very hard to get a warning on that tornado. Lead time was about 2 to 3 minutes. Luckily, no fatalities. I don't think there were any injuries, a lot of tree damage, some roof damage, but overall, it could have been a lot worse.
It's not often that you see tornadoes touch down in urban areas like that, but Glisson said it's just as likely as anywhere else.
So as we expand that urban footprint, we're seeing more strikes on suburban areas, but there's really no mechanism that can protect a city from tornadoes. We talk about the heat island effect with all the concrete and metal in a urban area. Warmer temperatures, we think of more stable flow, but overall micro scale features like thunderstorms and tornadoes are not really impacted by urban areas. They can strike anywhere.
Glisson added that the crops were very lucky to avoid a lot of damage because we've seen derechos in the past that have decimated our corn and soybeans.
The higher the corn, the more closed the canopy for soybeans. That's where you get a lot more damage from hail and wind. So we think of the August 10th derecho in 2020. Corn was at its peak. Soybean canopies were closed, and we saw epic damage across the state. Luckily, with the past event that we've seen in other severe weather events, we haven't seen as widespread of wind damage and hail damage. And speaking with our field agronomists in eastern Iowa, pleasantly surprised by the lack of widespread damage. So again, very lucky to have that type of situation given how extreme weather has been recently.
That again was Iowa's state climatologist Dr. Justin Glisson. I'm Riley Smith reporting.
A division of USDA's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service is responsible for determining regulations associated with a plant species developed through biotechnology. Rod Bain looks at part of the assessment process in this report.
Biotechnology in the realm of plants and if or how those should be regulated. That is part of the work with the Biotechnology Regulatory Services Division of USDA's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service. Biological scientist Abigail Walter coordinates the review status of genetically modified plants. She explains what exactly biotech in the plant realm might look like.
That might mean things like where we can take a gene from one organism and put it in another, or gene editing tools, where we can make very precise and targeted mutations in the genome of a plant to achieve a phenotype that we're looking for.
She says an important consideration when determining potential risk and regulation of a biotech plant is not all biotech products are the same. For instance, take an ornamental plant modified to change the color of its flowers for commercial sale.
In terms of the risk that it presents to agriculture, might impact agricultural services, might introduce some sort of new pest or pathogen complex, is not really something that we need to be worried about from a regulatory perspective.
However, take a tropical or subtropical plant that is genetically modified to allow for its reproduction in colder climates.
And as it moves, it has the possibility that it could be pulling a whole pest and pathogen complex with it, and that those organisms could start to affect other plants, or it could start to interact with the ecosystem, start to interfere with other plant agriculture.
Both examples dovetail into APHIS's approach to regulatory status review of biotech plants.
If we're familiar with the modified plant, with the biology of the plant, with what's going to happen with the modification, and it's well understood, and there is no reason to think that risk could increase from that plant, then we don't want to regulate it. If there is a scientifically plausible hypothesis that says that risk could increase, then we want to keep that plant regulated unless or until we have information that tells us that risk is unlikely.
This leads biotechnology regulatory services to conduct risk assessments, starting with,
could this affect when, where, and how the plant grows? And then there could be changes to the adverse consequence posed by the plant. We go through the initial review. We're looking at what is known about the plant and the modification. If we do come up with a hypothesis, that means that the process needs to proceed to the second stage, which is a plant pest risk assessment. Hopefully we would get information from the developer that would help us address the hypotheses we've identified.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
That's today's National Spotlight. Now here's the Livestock Report with John Harrith.
Canada is a top 5 destination for both U.S. beef and pork exports, but U.S. shipments are sometimes slowed by regulatory issues. The transition to the Public Health Information System, or PHIS, was intended to simplify this process, but as U.S. Meat Export Federation Director of Export Services Courtney Heller explains, some obstacles still remain.
Canada is one of our largest trading partners for both beef and pork. We value our relationship with that market extensively. Over the last couple of years, we've started to incorporate the PHIS export component, and the purpose was to improve and really shorten some of those interactions at the border to clear product more quickly in both directions. So PHIS was intended to reduce paperwork and human error. And when a system goes online, all of the paperwork, like letterhead certificates or testing requirements, go into that PHIS system, which allows the inspectors both on the USDA side and in Canada just see, sign, and process more quickly. We're finding that our electronic system is requiring paperwork, and that was not the intention. So we're working with Canada to streamline the documentation process.
USMEF is also working with industry partners such as the Meat Institute to eliminate other barriers for U.S. meat shipments to Canada.
We have found that some of our members have stopped shipping to Canada because of stoppages at the border. There's an effort underway now that was started by the Meat Institute in conjunction with their Canadian and American members to really address some of the slowdowns at the border that could be improved upon by reducing some of the inspection requirements or testing requirements. Our countries have virtually equivalent food safety systems, so some of our inspection processes could really be eased by just working together.
For more, please visit usmef.org. I'm John Harrith.
This is the AgNet News Hour. I'm Sabrina Halvorson. We will be back in just a moment with more of the day's agriculture news. Coming up in a few moments, we'll have today's This Land of Ours report, but first, more of the day's agriculture news. And with a preview of what you'll hear today on AgNet West, here's Brian German.
The California Department of Food and Agriculture has extended the deadline to apply for the Industrial Hemp Advisory Board. CDFA's Pest Exclusion Branch is accepting applications until July 31st for 2 midterm vacancies on the board. The Industrial Hemp Advisory Board is composed of 13 members, and the term of office for board members is 3 years. The board makes recommendations to the CDFA Secretary on all matters pertaining to industrial hemp law and regulations, enforcement, annual budgets, and the setting of the assessment rate. Members meet at least once per year, but may meet more frequently if needed. The board has 2 vacancies for representatives who are registered as growers of industrial hemp. The successful candidate will be appointed to serve the term, which expires on May 31st, 2026. More information is available on CDFA's homepage for the California Industrial Hemp Program. The USDA is reporting that farm businesses appear to be financially stable despite high interest rates. A summary from USDA's Economic Research Service indicates that larger farms tend to have higher debt and profit margins above 10%, while smaller farms often have lower margins and potentially more financial risk. Rising interest rates have increased farm debt expenses significantly, and large farms typically have more debt than small ones, with the average debt for large farms being over $1.8 million. However, farm businesses have maintained low debt-to-asset ratios indicating strong solvency. Debt-to-asset ratios vary by commodity specialization and operator age, with poultry farms and younger operators generally having higher ratios. Nonetheless, all ratios remain well below the 55% stress threshold, showing overall financial health in the sector. A coalition of more than 500 organizations are urging Congress to pass a new farm bill this year. In a letter sent to congressional leaders, the organizations state that, quote, as committed stakeholders and beneficiaries of the Farm Bill, we cannot continue to wait for updated policies, provisions, initiatives, and critical funding that support our collective interests. The groups represent various sectors such as agriculture, nutrition, conservation, and rural development, and stress the importance of the Farm Bill for millions of Americans. One of the signatories of the letter, American Farm Bureau Federation, noted that passing a stopgap extension of the legislation would put it at risk of further delay. The groups emphasized that delaying the Farm Bill any longer would risk even further postponement due to upcoming elections and a new Congress. The organizations believe a bipartisan effort is needed to enact the Farm Bill before the end of the year to continue essential support for Farm Bill programs. A recent court decision has granted Wonderful Nurseries a preliminary injunction to stop the bargaining process with the United Farm Workers Union. The ruling comes as legal concerns are being raised about California's card check law, AB 113. The law, intended to simplify union formation for farm workers, is under scrutiny for potentially violating constitutional rights, with the judge in the case noting that Wonderful was being, quote, forced to comply with a process that is likely unconstitutional. Western Growers President Dave Puglia praised the ruling, emphasizing the importance of preserving farm workers' fundamental rights, including due process and the freedom to choose union representation without coercion. The injunction halts all union-related activities at Wonderful Nurseries, including hearings on alleged unfair labor practices and mediation for a collective bargaining agreement. The 2024 Commodity Fumigation Summit is coming up next week in Modesto. Hosted by the Western Agricultural Processors Association in partnership with Cardinal Professional Products, the summit will be taking place on Wednesday, July 31st at Harvest Hall in Modesto. Stanislaus County Ag Commissioner Linda Penfold will be giving a presentation about common violations and enforcement, followed by research chemist with USDA Spencer Walsh providing information about post-harvest fumigation for food security and safety. Following the break, DPR will give a presentation about the state view of fumigation and sustainable pest management. There will also be several product manufacturer updates from a variety of exhibitors. Continuing education credits with DPR will be available, but the number of hours is still pending. More information about the summit is available on the upcoming events page at agnetwest.com. I'm Brian German for AgNet West Radio Network.
It's an invitation for small meat processing plants. That's coming up on This Land of Ours. USDA says it's going the extra mile to provide the information that the operators of small meat processing plants need to thrive. Administrator of USDA's Food Safety and Inspection Service, Paul Kicker, explains the purpose of USDA's small processing plant roundtables.
That it gives us the opportunity to get out and meet with those that are running these small, very small operations. And it gives them the opportunity to reach out to the FSIS upper management and ask any questions that they have, bring any concerns forward, anything that they want to discuss at all. There's no limitations on what we discuss or what we don't discuss. It's completely up to them on how specific they want to get about questions or comments that they have.
You're listening to the AgNet News Hour. Researchers say there are many problems associated with too much screen time. Gary Crawford has more on this edition of Agriculture USA.
Let's go back to the early 1950s when TV was the big new technology, which had dozens and dozens of shows for kids.
What time is it, kids?
Howdy Doody Time. And even then, child development experts were already warning about the amount of time kids were spending in front of the screen. Some were worried about the possible physical, mental, and emotional effects that too much screen time could have on kids. So now let's fast forward to the present, where we don't just have one little TV screen in the house. We've got screens everywhere.
So everything from reading a book on a tablet or TVs or smartphones.
And so screen times, especially for children, have skyrocketed. Coming up on this edition of Agriculture USA, the dangers of too much screen time and what families can do about it. I'm Gary Crawford. How much time do you think you spend looking at screens every day? How much time? And how much time do your sons and daughters spend? Well, some studies suggest the average American adult spends 7 hours a day in front of a screen, not counting work time. And for kids age 8 through 18, it's 7.5 hours. And here's the ironic part.
The recommendation for adults, for teens and adults, is only 2 hours per day.
Oh, whoa, two hours? Are you kidding me? 2 hours?
No, I know. I'm guilty as well.
Pronouncing himself guilty as charged is Kansas State University child development specialist Bradford Wiles. He says too much screen time for young children often causes those kids to develop behavioral problems getting along with others, including their parents and siblings. And as teens or preteens,
there are significant negative effects of screen time around anxiety, depression, attention, academic achievement. And then, of course, there are some confounding factors there in that we also know that social media is just really, really bad, particularly for girls. And in adults, too. It puts everybody at risk for obesity. It can affect your relationships. It can affect your sleep cycles.
And screen time seems to act almost like a drug. You want more and more, and you can't stop watching. And trying to limit screen time can be very difficult.
It's a real challenge. And by the way, it's a real challenge for me. I mean, particularly right now, March Madness is on, so I really want to see the games and check the scores. And at the end of the day, that's just, again, telling my kids that what's going on in NCAA basketball is more important than them. And that's never the thing I want to convey.
But Bradford Wiles says we parents are role models for our young children, and if we are constantly on our phones and not paying attention to the children or engaging with them,
you are tacitly telling them that what is on the screen is more important than what they are doing.
So he says, obviously, it would be a good idea to cut screen time down from that 7-hour average down to the recommended 1 to 2 hours, but that is a big lift.
It's a constant battle. It's something that adults really have to focus on.
But Wiles says to win that battle,
set your goals in a tiered manner so that you're not going cold turkey. You're able to wean off of things. So be realistic about them. It's a marathon, not a sprint.
But this first idea may seem like a sprint. It may be considered a pretty radical thing to do in many homes today. It's simply this.
No phones or screens at meals. Mealtime is really, really important for physical health, mental health. Family mealtime is really critical. And so you completely diminish that if you're all sitting around watching the TV.
Wiles also suggests setting up no screen places in other parts of the house.
That helps, again, reinforce those common areas. Typically, those are common areas, so that when you're there, you're engaging with your family.
Oh, and yes, Wiles says this is not all about banning screens and devices, such as video games. In fact,
playing video games together with your child can be okay. Again, limit the screen time to the hour overall for your child. But if you want to do something together, that's okay, as long as the technology is just an excuse for your own engagement.
And that's the whole idea behind cutting screen time. But again, Wiles says do it gradually. And if you need some good practical ideas for reducing screen time for you and your family, the Mayo Clinic has an online program. It's pretty neat. It's called Slim Your Screen Time. So you can spend some of that screen time to find out how to slim the screen time down. Just go online, search Slim Your Screen Time. This has been Agriculture USA. I'm Gary Crawford reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
Heat stroke and stress can sneak up on you without you being fully aware of it. We go back to Gary Crawford once again.
During this blistering summer, millions of us are either coping directly with the record-breaking heat or certainly have heard news reports about it. It's big news.
More than 125 million Americans are under heat alerts. That's more than 1/3 of the United States population. In the coming days,
reportedly, thousands of people have been suffering from heat-related illnesses. Hundreds have died from heat stroke this summer. And although some of us may say, nah, we're tough, heat doesn't bother us, one expert says
heat illness is something we shouldn't just kind of glance over.
That's Dee Jepson. She's a professor of safety and health, Ohio State University, and she says a lot of people get very sick from the heat and many lose their lives from it because the symptoms can sort of sneak up on you, and those symptoms may not be noticed at first by others around you. Also, she says the symptoms vary with each person.
Heat illness is really hard to recognize and hard to predict because each one of our bodies, are so different.
And susceptibility to the heat varies with age, with the kinds of medications we may be on, and with how acclimated we are to being in the heat in the first place.
And we also know that once a person has had heat stress or heat stroke, they are more susceptible to that again sooner.
So we're going to try to touch on the general symptoms to watch out for in ourselves and in others, starting with mild symptoms and working up to the more serious. And again, different folks will exhibit different signs of heat stress. First,
if you get a heat rash or any type of prickly or blistery parts of the skin, that's showing that your sweat glands have become clogged, your sweat glands are inflamed, and the sweat cannot evaporate from your body in these conditions.
Another early warning sign, heat cramps.
Whether that's in your legs, your arms, or your stomach. And really what's happening when our bodies are cramping, it's the loss of body salt through the sweat. And that causes the water to rush into our muscles, and that results in our cramps and our spasms that we get.
But as the effects of the heat really start to intensify and become more dangerous, we may experience
fatigue or dizziness, even irritability, impaired judgment, any type of lack of ability to concentrate.
Things are really getting serious at that point.
Now the heat is affecting our blood flow into our brain. The body's trying to redirect that blood to release the heat from the skin. But when it does that, it kind of starts to affect us through our whole nervous system.
And at that point, we have to get cooled down pretty fast because Jepson says when our body temperature goes above 100 degrees for any length of time out there in that heat,
that's in the fatal zone.
So those are some things to watch for next time, how to better handle the heat and avoid heat stress and stroke in the first place. Gary Crawford reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
This is the AgNet News Hour. We will be back in just a moment with more agriculture news. Welcome back to the AgNet News Hour. In November of 2023, the Daughtry Water for Food Global Institute announced a new USAID Feed the Future Innovation Lab for irrigation and mechanization systems. That is the topic of this episode of the Water for Food podcast.
Welcome to the Water for Food podcast. My name is Ariana Elnis. I'm the communications specialist for the Daughtry Water for Food Global Institute at the University of Nebraska, which is proud to lead USAID's Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Irrigation and Mechanization Systems, or ILMS. The purpose of this new lab's research is to expand the use of irrigation and mechanization technologies and practices in an inclusive, economically, and environmentally sustainable way. Today, I'm happy to introduce ILM's new Deputy Director, Jude Cobbing, and we'll be talking with him about what drew him to ILMS and the opportunities he sees within the project. Jude, thank you so much for joining me today, and we'll just go ahead and dive right into it. So Jude, can you just start by introducing yourself, talk a bit about your background and how it relates to ILMS?
Sure, thank you, Ariana, and it's great to be here, and hello to all the listeners. My name's Jude Cobbing. I'm the new Deputy Director, and I'm really excited to be at ILMS. My background, as you can probably hear, I didn't grow up in the United States. I was born in Zimbabwe and grew up mainly in South Africa. I studied geology in my undergraduate in Cape Town, and when I finished that, I decided I didn't want to go into mining, which most people were doing at the time in South Africa, and I ended up working for a small non-profit in a very rural part of South Africa, working on water supply and agricultural systems, including irrigation, small pumps and so on. And it was a really exciting time to be doing that in South Africa. It was right after the first democratic elections. Nelson Mandela was the new president, and I learned a huge amount in that first year. It really sparked an interest in groundwater resources. It was a part of the country where there was a lot of reliance on wells and boreholes, and I ended up later going to study groundwater, and I did that in London. I did a master's in hydrogeology and then worked in England for 5 years for the British Geological Survey on a whole range of technical issues to do with groundwater, both in Britain but also in Africa. We had the BGS still had some programs that were working on groundwater in countries like Nigeria and Malawi and Ghana. And I was lucky enough to go and work in some of those countries and work on things like water quality and where to drill for groundwater and various other issues, but mostly sort of, I guess you could call them technical hydrogeology issues. I after working in the UK, then I was back in South Africa for nearly 10 years, working first in the research sector and later in the private sector on a whole range of things, on water supply in South Africa, working alongside the Department of Water Affairs on basic water supplies, water quality, the national groundwater strategy in South Africa, but also working on mine water. There was a lot of, and still is a lot of pollution-related issues in South Africa to do with the mining legacy. And so I got involved quite heavily in that and got very interested in groundwater quality and remediation of groundwater. And as time went on, I got more and more interested in the kind of sort of, let's call them the social and institutional side of groundwater work. And obviously the sort of technical groundwater conditions were important, but it was often the social and institutional factors that were the determining conditions for success in any particular project. And I started doing my PhD in South Africa part-time, looking at an aquifer in the northern part of the country where there's a very heavy irrigation industry, but the water is also used for domestic supply and for industry as well. So there's a lot of stakeholders there who all utilize that groundwater. And the aquifer I was interested in was very heavily studied. We knew a lot about it hydrogeologically, and yet we were still seeing big problems with overdraft and contestation over water rights and so on. And my PhD was all about how what's really going on there. Why is it that we, even though we know a huge amount about this technically, we've got this set of very good laws, very progressive laws and policy, and yet we still seem to be failing in management of it. And I was fascinated by that and did that as my PhD thesis under a very interesting supervisor who was a transdisciplinarian. He was a geologist originally, but had become convinced that we needed to look much further than just the so-called hard sciences to look for solutions and sustainability. I moved to the US in 2015, and at that stage I was finishing off my PhD, but I started consulting to the World Bank in Washington, D.C. on African groundwater resources, and was lucky enough to coincide with the project they were doing on quantifying groundwater in Africa, both for domestic use, but also for small-scale irrigation, and worked with some really interesting people on a couple of reports looking at African groundwater resource sustainability, and particularly under climate change. Then most recently, I worked for Save the Children in Washington, D.C. as well as a water sanitation and hygiene specialist focusing on Africa, until starting at ILMS 5-6 weeks ago.
And we're so happy to have you here. So can you tell us about the ILMS project and what makes it unique and what drew you to it?
Yes, of course. So ILMS is a project that takes a systems approach to the problems, let's call them, of mechanization and irrigation in the global south, mostly in Africa, but in Central America and South Asia as well. And by which I mean we look at the whole range of factors that basically determine the success or failure of small farmers implementing irrigation and mechanization systems. And that, that's something that's often a lot of lip service is paid to, but it's often not observed in reality. And I think the unique attribute of ILMS is that we really do want to look at all of those different factors and focus on, what are the bottlenecks or what are the weak links in the chain that prevent small farmers from accessing irrigation and mechanization technology and related services and increasing sustainability, increasing on-farm yields, increasing economic growth at the farmer scale. And we intend to manage a portfolio of research that will give us insights into that whole value chain. And I think, that might sound a bit high level, but it really is important at a time when I think a lot of people are highly specialized and are just, have one, they're just feeling one part of the elephant in the dark room. Nobody has a kind of big picture. And we at ILMS are hoping to retain that big picture capacity. So that really interested me about ILMS. The other thing, obviously, is that, ILMS were right bang in the middle of Nebraska where, irrigation is almost the state business. There's not much that Nebraskans don't know about irrigation and how to manage successful and sustainable irrigation value chains. Let's just put it that way. And I think there's a tremendous amount that ILMS can take from the context in Nebraska and transfer or make that technology available or make some of that knowledge available in partnership with small farmers particularly in Africa. So that's the other thing. It's certainly no coincidence that ILMS is at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, and that it really is ground zero for irrigation, particularly irrigation on groundwater, as you know.
This again was from the Water for Food podcast. You're listening to the AgNet News Hour. Now for more news. The Agriculture Secretary recently explained ways in which urban agriculture and USDA's efforts to improve equity in farming are connected. Rod Bain reports.
A connection between urban agriculture and efforts to improve equity in ag. That area of focus was presented by Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack during a recent visit to Philadelphia. And he noted the underlying principle for the connection and the success in advancing urban ag and equity.
What a profound idea of reconnecting with people, of relying on relationships to solve problems.
The Regional Equity Convening Northeast Edition was held in conjunction with the Keystone State's annual Urban Agriculture Week and focused its meeting on urban farming. The Secretary used the opportunity to discuss federal investments of
nearly $100 million in a variety of programs designed to expand access to urban agriculture, creating in 17 cities sort of the model for how we would be able to support urban agriculture. Philadelphia being one of those 17 cities.
What some of these investments look like on the ground level include
composting. We've done 119 composting awards across 41 states. We've invested in people's gardens to encourage more access and relationship between what can be grown and raised and what can be made available to those who are in need of food assistance. We've established cooperative agreements. We've made a commitment to establishing Farm Service Agency offices in these cities so that the loan, the conservation, the crop insurance benefits that are available to those who live, work, and raise their family in rural places are also available to those who live, raise, and work in urban centers who are farmers.
Expanding upon the nature and scope of the cooperative agreements,
the department has entered into between NRCS, our conservation folks, and our FSA folks who provide credit financing, over 130 different cooperative agreements with organizations that represent historically underserved producers.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
That's today's top agriculture news. I'm Sabrina Halvorson. Thank you for sharing your morning with us.
To get more information on the topics you heard today, visit AgNet West online at agnetwest.com. You can also stay connected by following us on our social media at AgNet West on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can also find our broadcast team of Brian German and Sabrina Halvorson on Facebook and Twitter. Thank you for listening to the AgNet News Hour from AgNet West. AgNet West Radio Network, your primary choice for agriculture news.